So the topic was, in oversimplified terms, if 2005 was the year of global peak oil, worldwide oil production in the year 2030 will be the same as it was in 1980. However, the world's population in 2030 will be both much larger, approximately twice, and much more industrialized, oil-dependent, than it was in 1980. Consequently, worldwide demand for oil will outpace worldwide production of oil by a significant margin. As a result, the price may skyrocket, oil-dependent economies may crumble, and resource wars could ignite. Peak oil, fact or fiction, and why? Well, we think it's fiction, at least for now. We don't think peak oil is coming, and if anything does come, it may be hydrocarbon peak, because we are going to be harnessing not just crude oil, but gas, shale gas, conventional, unconventional, and all the fossil fuels that, if we are going to meet this future demand. At the same time, we talked about technology development, which is going to make it possible to maybe increase the amount of oil that we can extract, and gas, and shale eventually when we get the economics and the drills right. Oil prices obviously will determine, because you're actually not going to get rid of oil. Fossil fuel will still make a large percentage of the mix in the next few decades. And oil prices will determine just how much is displaced by what somebody at our table insisted I call alternatives, and somebody else suggested as complementary energies rather than renewables, because alternatives cover everything else that's going to develop, and the pace at which they develop and the share of the energy mix will be determined by oil prices, which we're now seeing at $100. And you don't hear too many people who are investing in these alternatives and renewables shouting too much about the high oil price, because you're going to need them in order to displace fossil fuel. That's for the environmentalists. So, as I said, we're talking about peak hydrocarbons as opposed to fossil fuels, things like gas to liquids, which will come into play, and as Dr. Yabhouni pointed out, we are going to need every single one of these energy sources in order to meet future demand. But there is no danger, because OPEC is still going to be in a dominant position. In fact, the onus is going to be more on OPEC to provide the incremental barrel, because we're going to see declines from elsewhere. And I think one of the things that we talked about feeding the peak oil theorists is that the OPEC countries are dominated by the national oil companies, and there are doubts as to the size of their reserves. Do people believe them? And the answer is not really, but so long as we keep producing, and I think we're seeing more as oil prices go up, people pumping at capacity. The world is not short of oil at the moment, nor is it going to be for many, many years to come, at least not in our generation. And as you get alternatives and renewables coming into the mix, you're going to have more oil that's going to stay in the ground. We talked about declines. And the more important thing is that we have a geopolitical situation which nobody foresaw, where you had Egypt coming in, the crisis in Egypt raising the price. I know that people like to talk about these sort of unknowns that are going to have an impact on what happens to the upstream. Forgot to mention that the price of oil will also determine how much goes into downstream. Are people going to be looking more to invest in downstream and refining and value-added industry and keeping more of the crude oil in the ground, which I think we're seeing in countries like Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, I think, with the North Field. But there are certain geopolitical situations that are keeping some countries from actually developing their resources. Iran is one example, closed for business at the moment, not producing as much as it can, as much as it potentially can. And countries like Iraq, which is now just coming into play. Again, is Iraq going to go into peak and then decline very quickly, because you've got IOCs who are really looking at the bottom line as opposed to managing that resource base? And then once Iraq has fulfilled that role, do you then have Iran coming in with the resolution of the nuclear crisis, which does not appear to be happening at the moment? But the upshot is we don't see also prices skyrocketing because you are going to have displacement of fossil fuels. Resource wars could ignite more. I think we didn't really discuss this, but I'll take a punt and say more on the supply side than the demand side than the supply side, as you get a lot of these industrialized countries like in Asia. So peak oil, fact or fiction? We think for now fiction, but we're keeping an open mind for the future. Thank you.